I'm Lois, and I'm the innkeeper at the Baldpate Inn, and we thank you all for coming and joining us tonight for our very last summer Enchanted evening of the season. We are honored. I guess we've saved one of our best till last. We're honored to have Dr. Thomas back with us tonight, and always one of our favorite speakers. You never know the twist at the end of the story. He leads you right up to the end, and then he gives you some twist. So we love that. And I thank you all for being loyal supporters of us this summer, and hope we've lived up to your expectations, or at least coped along with you on all the adjustments for the season. So anyways, turn it over to Dr. Thomas, and away we go.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It used to be that I would always wear a tie. And I realized I can't wear ties anymore because I can't afford the constant dry cleaning bill I'd have to go through. So now it's about themed masks. So tonight I decided to wear my Dude Ranch themed mask since we'll be talking about dude ranches or guest ranches in Rocky Mountain National Park. So bear with me one moment. So tonight we're going to talk about a twist in American history, a big one that I think is very underappreciated, and it has to do with the nature of private property and concepts of the public good, which have changed very dramatically in a very short period of time in American history. This, what I'm going to deliver to you tonight, was part of a project developed for Rocky Mountain National Park through Colorado State University's Public Lands History Center, where I serve as a senior researcher, and I'm on the governing council. And it was essentially to complete a cultural landscape inventory, a CLI, of two adjacent former dude ranches or guest ranches on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park, Green Mountain Ranch and Onahu Ranch. And we're going to use them as a case study because I really started thinking about this issue as I did that research on these two places. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, or where I'm talking about, here we are up by Lily Lake. And then if we wanted to take a nice ride over Trail Ridge Road, maybe stop in at the Visitor Center, Alpine Visitor Center, come on back down right before we're going to I'm talking about. Here's a close-up view. This is the Green Mountain Trailhead right here. So these are just across the road from the Green Mountain Trailhead, and they are literally right beside each other. In fact, today, you can't tell the difference. You can't tell where one ends and the other begins. But there was at one time a fairly distinctive line there. So I want to start by meditating on a letter. It's a letter that Carl and Ada Nelson, longtime owners of Green Mountain Ranch, wrote to George Hartzog, who was then director of the National Park Service. They actually knew him personally because he was formerly a deputy superintendent here at Rocky Mountain National Park. And they wrote this as they were finalizing the contract to sell their ranch to the National Park Service. And it says, "We finally decided there must be a time of fruition of one's efforts. And why should we continue on and on? We feel that in living at Green Mountain Ranch, the Lord has given us one of the beauty spots of Rocky Mountain National Park, and we surely are happy that it will now belong to the National Park Service for their use. We never felt that we could ever sell any part of it to private owners." Let that just sink in for a moment. In the long scope, the long arc of American history, those last two sentences are profound. This idea that it will now belong to the National Park Service, the federal government, and that we could never sell any part of it to private owners. That is not what American history has been about, right? As the United States filled out the continent through purchases and war and treaties, the relationship between the federal government and private property took on powerful meanings. While the United States now controlled a tremendous amount of territory, it didn't actually make sense for the federal government to own that territory. That's the way European monarchies did things. The monarch owned land, the lords owned land. That wasn't the way the United States was going to do this. And it wasn't desirable, and there's a lot of reasons for this. One of it has to do with the nature of private land tied to the ideal Republican citizen. This is lowercase Republican, the idea of the ideal citizen of the early republic, what Jefferson called the yeoman farmer, right? There was, among the founding fathers, land ownership was crucial to being a proper, virtuous Republican. Easy private property ownership would help populate empty territory. Please notice my quotes because they're very important right here. Because that's the fundamental flaw of all of this, was the continent wasn't empty at all. There were millions and millions of people living here who had developed very advanced civilization. Those would be the native peoples who lived here, who were completely excluded from all of this. So we must always remember that. Then private property ownership solved a big problem. That is, public land ownership is expensive. You have to police it, you have to set up forts, you have to get supplies out to it. On the other hand, if you can turn it into private property, it becomes a taxable commodity, right? So there's an economic necessity in doing this as well. And then the final piece of this, and the Homestead Acts and the transcontinental railroads all come at the same time. And there's a reason for that. And that is, you can't argue building these enormous public works projects. Some historians have called it, the Transcontinental Railroad was the equivalent of sending a man to the moon in the 19th century. It was that big of a project. You couldn't do that if there was nothing out there, right? You had to argue that, well, we're going to fill up, there's going to be cities, there's going to be population centers. Uh-oh, been disconnected. We'll take a pause here. And you can soak in the first Homestead Act here. And this was, and a lot of you probably know this from basic American history here. This is History 101. It's a federal land, a homestead, for little or no cost. And it starts with an effort to take this land and give it to free soilers, to people who are not sympathetic with the Southern cause. So the yeoman farmer ideal we talked about, that's Jefferson's ideal citizen, it came and butted against sort of the reality of what was actually going on in Jefferson's Virginia, and that was planters and slavery. And this is something Northerners wanted to counter in this Western expansion. Southern Democrats continually fought any sort of efforts to provide a liberal land policy in the West. But then, of course, the Civil War happens, makes it much easier. So the intent of the first Homestead Act of 1862 was to liberalize the preemption acts as much as possible. Its leading advocates were Andrew Johnson, George Henry Evans, and Horace Greeley, our very own Horace Greeley. And they demanded that new lands be made available for farmers who were entrepreneurs, not for these big planters of the South. And they finally got their way whenever the South left the Union during the Civil War. So here's what it did. It gave you 160 acres, a quarter section. A section is a mile by a mile. A quarter section is 1/4 of that. For any citizen who could pay a small filing fee and settle on it. You had to prove it up. You had to somehow prove that you're using that land. That could be really liberal, what that meant. It was open to any citizen, advantage of the program, regardless of age or of race or gender, which is pretty remarkable in American history at this time period. So when they say it was a liberal land policy, for this period, yeah, that's huge. Finally, the only restrictions were that the applicant had to be 21 and the head of a household and never taken up arms against the U.S. government. That's a slight against the Confederates, against the rebels. So it's a simple process. You filed an application. You would say, I want this quarter section. You would describe it. You would improve it somehow. Improve should be in quotes because that could be judgment. And then you would file a deed of title that would be recorded. This is what the patent would look like. You would get in the end of this process. Pretty well all the land in Colorado, except those that stemmed from the Mexican land grants, look like this. At some point, this record existed for all those properties. And the Homestead Act is interesting because of its tenaciousness, right? Well, one of the first things that people begin to realize is that, okay, you can get this 160 acres, but once you get west of this line, the 100th meridian, 160 acres isn't a whole heck of a lot, particularly when it's dry or you're trying to ranch, right? And so after this, they're going to keep trying to improve the Homestead Act to deal with the reality of Western aridity over and over again. So there's such an investment into making it easy for Americans to get this land out of the public domain. So you're going to get the Timber Culture Act of 1873, which is one of my favorites. The whole logic behind this was, you know what? What the Great Plains lack is rain and trees. So maybe if people planted trees, it would start raining, right? So their logic was backwards. But it would actually, you could do an additional quarter section if you planted 40 acres of trees. And to this day, if you're out on the plains, you will see cottonwoods at the corners of the quarter sections. Those are remnants of the Timber Culture Act. And it was predicated, as I said, on that failed logic of rain following the plow, essentially. Then we get other amendments. I'm not going to go through these, but they're just other changes to make it even easier, even though this landscape is harsh for agricultural purposes, to increase the availability of this land. Largely, but basically what it's saying is we're going to give you bigger land if you take more marginal land. So how is it then that the entire arc of American history had been about the easy acquisition and proliferation of private property, right? That's everything from the Civil War on. How does it then become natural and inevitable to sell it back to the federal government in the 1960s and 70s? That's a big question we need to look at, because for Americans before this period, this would have seemed illogical to ever do this. So what led inholders to sell their land back to the federal government in the form of the National Park Service rather than pursuing a private sale that would, in almost every case I've ever seen, resulted in more profit, right? So this is very counter to the American notions of capitalism. So here's my proposal for why this is, right? And that's changing ideas of recreation. We'll go into each one of these. Evolving National Park Service policies, and finally, environmental consciousness in the United States are going to lead to this big shift in understandings of private property and the public good. So again, those three big changes: recreation and leisure culture, evolving National Park Service policies, especially Mission 66, which we'll get into, and these ideas of environmental consciousness. And I want to point out, I'm not saying these are mutually exclusive. They're not. In fact, they're all very tightly connected together. The remnants of the early movements, the early roots of the environmental movement are tied up in Mission 66, which is creating a feedback loop that's also influencing recreation, how you recreate in the parks. It's all changing. These things are all related. So changing notions of recreation and leisure culture. What's very interesting is these ranches on the west side of the park are an utter failure until they become guest ranches. And it's not until Americans want to vacation on a ranch that that's possible. So there has to be that first big change, which occurs in the 1930s, when Americans used to spend a month on vacation, maybe even an entire summer on vacation. Here, it's now the Depression. You don't want to spend so much. The Dude Ranch was a perfect way of solving that issue. It was affordable, and yet you could still spend a long, exciting vacation there. This is from a brochure from the Union Pacific Railroad, and of all these activities they have on here, this is the one I like the most. It says corral sitting, right? You all know how interested you've been in corral sitting. So Mission 66 is another piece that's in here. This was a 10-year National Park Service program that was meant to dramatically expand visitor services in the park by 1966, which happened to be the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the National Park Service. So there's a lot of infrastructure improvements going on this time, particularly geared at visitors. Now, Rocky Mountain National Park specifically identified the removal of what they called non-conforming inholdings as one of their most important aspects of Mission 66. I'm going to quote here from a report put together by researchers at the Public Lands History Center. Rachel, sitting right over there, helped with this report. This quote is that while Rocky modernized its technology and architecture under Mission 66, it simultaneously sought to restore naturalness through the purchase and obliteration or reuse of inholdings. Emphasizing restoration and protection of the natural environment, the park removed evidence of pre-NPS land use activities and eliminated public overnight accommodations other than camping as rapidly as the private property can be acquired and existing land contracts expired. Right? So there's a big movement to get rid of these land holdings. And then finally, another change that's going to come after Mission 66 is going to be the Opportunity Purchase Act. One of the big problems the park faced in Mission 66 was, all right, so-and-so's ready to sell their land, their inholding. The park doesn't have money for it. The park would be like, well, we're not going to have money for a purchase for 3 more years. Right? This solved the problem. It gave money ahead of time. Basically said there's this many millions of dollars earmarked for whatever property purchases, inholding purchases you want to commit to. Then finally is the emerging environmental consciousness. And it's going to be very interesting that that change I'm trying to identify is happening right there when all these other changes are occurring as well. The Wilderness Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act. It's all coming in the 1960s. And I added a couple. This is actually a slide from the Park Service. But I added Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which brought environmental consciousness into the public domain, into popular culture, and then the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. Here's some other things I saw, and you'll see as I tell you the story of these two places that I think are related to those changes. I'm just not exactly sure how yet. But you're going to see that. One is that the Kawanichi Valley was terrible. I mean, it's gorgeous for us now as we descend Trail Ridge Road and just see the Colorado River meandering through there. It was a landscape of hardship, isolation, and misery. If any of you are familiar with Thomas Adams' book, Coyote Valley, that's about the Kawanichi Valley, he goes into this, the problems with the environmental, the particular environment of that valley. And it had a lot of issues for women. Women really struggle in this environment, and it unfairly affected women. You'll see how. There's a shift in land use paradigms from cattle ranching to guest ranching. We're going to see that. The creation of the park did nothing to help these places, which I was surprised by. I expected to see something. Completion of Fall River Road didn't help them. Trail Ridge Road, though, that's a game changer. That suddenly opened up these ranches to a much broader audience, much broader public than they would have seen before. And then that transition where you'll see this. Whenever these inholders initially want to sell, the Park Service is only one of many suitors. By the end of this period, that's the only place you're going to sell it. Not that the park is offering more money. They're not. But it's that change in the ethic. And finally, inholders and park staff shared very close relationships. Sometimes extremely close, like they got married sort of relationships, which I think actually helps explain some of this. So let's briefly go through the history of Green Mountain Ranch. It's the bigger, better known of the two of them. On January 29th, 1888, Fred Hurdle filed for a 160-acre homestead claim. Here you can see it's not a quarter section, but he got 2 half-quarter sections and put them together to get his 160 acres. This was common in the mountains to do it that way. He provided proof of his improvements on August 20th, 1894, and received his land patent in 1895. He was actually born to German parents. They traveled by ox across the plain from St. Joseph, Missouri. They settled in Elizabeth. Eventually, Fred Hurdle married Minnie Brockman in Middle Park. This is going to be the first time of many times we hear this. They had to leave because Minnie had, quote, an inability to stand the high altitude. And it forced the couple to move back to Elbert County in 1897. This is the most famous figure associated with Green Mountain Ranch because he looms large in the history of Grand Lake, and that is that's Henry Schnorr, who purchased it from Hurdle in July 15th, 1897. He actually was born in Denmark, and he was trained as a draftsman and architect at the university in Kiel, Germany. He arrived in the United States in 1882. He also was out in Elbert County, so it could be that he had known Fred Hurdle. And he worked primarily as a carpenter. In fact, that's his big imprint. If you sort of want to know, if you've gone to Grand Lake, you've seen the buildings there have a very distinctive wood siding pattern that really only exists around Grand Lake. He's the guy where that comes from. He created that vernacular. So like the Hurdles before him, he really struggled here because it was so isolated, the environment was so harsh. He struck up a relationship with his next door neighbors next door, which would have been the Harbisons. That name is still on the west side of the park. And he thought that his relationship was going really well with one of their daughters, Kitty Harbison. And he thought, well, she was going to marry him. So he built this house on Green Mountain Ranch. Fairly sophisticated, advanced house for this time period, particularly in the Kawanishi Valley. And he purposely put this window on the south side because she loved geraniums. And he figured it'd be a perfect place for her to grow her geraniums. He probably should have figured out if she wanted to marry him first, because it turned out she didn't. He was heartbroken over this. He eventually marries a woman named Hattie. They have two daughters, Beatrice and Mary Alice, who was known as Mamie. But Hattie Schnorr hated living here, hated it. So much so that after she had her second daughter, she left, disappeared. And they eventually divorced. Henry was unable to take care of his children. He actually sent them to an orphanage in Denver. It was a cruel time. He realized they're actually too sick for the orphanage, so he brought them to the Harbison daughters. So even though they weren't married, the Harbison girls still ended up raising his children, which is kind of strange. This is actually Schnorr right here, the Harbison girls, and these are his two daughters from his first marriage. He eventually remarried Carrie Stowell Schuster, but the youngest daughter, Mamie, refused to leave the Harbisons because it was the only family she ever knew. So there's so much heartbreak and hardship there. Then there's all of these transactions that are going on, right? Because this just doesn't work. Everybody's trying to cattle ranch there. Your pastures are too wet or they're too dry. It's just not working well. Here we get the Rocky Mountain National Park founded, and we're going to go all the way down to Henry Cowgill in 1917, who again has just a heartbreaking story. Henry Cowgill purchased this land for his son. His son's name was, if I can find it here, Glenn Cowgill, and he purchased it in 1916. Unfortunately, something was going to come that was going to take a young man like Glenn Cowgill away, and that was World War I. So he lived for about 2 years here. He went and he served in World War I. He ended up dying, I believe, in the Battle of Hindenburg Line, and that's part of the 100 Days Offensive, and he's buried in France, so he never returned. So heartbroken, the family doesn't quite know what to do with it. The younger son, whose name is Morse Cowgill, says, hey, why don't we just live there? They all moved over to here. They didn't realize how hard it was. The father eventually dies. Morse Cowgill didn't know how to do anything here. There's stories of people going by his ranch and finding 20 head of cattle dead in a snowstorm while Morse Cowgill drank and played cards. So it was very difficult. But then in 1932, something happens that changes the prospect pretty well of everything on the west side of the park, and that's the completion of Trail Ridge Road. Buying this parcel at a tax sale on March 19th was Carl and Jesse Nelson, who at last brought a major stability, and that was transforming it from a cattle ranch into a guest ranch. They actually started out with a little dairy operation. There's a quote here that Carl Nelson didn't know a cow from a horse when he started. He actually ran a cigar stand before he ran this, so he really didn't know what he was doing. They moved in here happily enough. They ran their little dairy operation, but we're not done with misery yet. His first wife was killed in an automobile accident in Aurora. So a year later, he remarries, and I think it's that remarriage that really is when this thing becomes Green Mountain Ranch, the guest ranch. They greatly expand the main house into a lodge. There you can still see that same window, except now it's been, of course, modified. It's much larger. but that's still the same Henry Schnorr's original cabin. And they expanded dramatically between 1938 and 1940. They begin building other guest cabins. They eventually build pretty well the most substantial guest ranch on the west side of the park, with the exception of maybe Holsworth Ranch. Construction continued with 9 guest cabins that could house 2 to 8 guests. Eventually, all cabins received additions with private bathrooms, which is sort of unheard of at this time. At its high point, Green Mountain Ranch had the capacity to serve up to 30 guests on the American plan, which rates included your accommodation and your meals in the dining room, and it could handle 50 more outside of that plan. That meant like people who were camping, doing things like that. By 1950s, the Nelsons promoted Green Mountain Ranch as, quote, the friendliest ranch in the West. Activities included fishing, boating, hiking, picnics, roping, rodeos, and horseback riding. There's a picture, I believe, from the 40s, given the car here. Very late 40s, but an unusual color picture. So what about Onahu Ranch? Onahu Ranch always existed in the shadow of Green Mountain Ranch. Again, they're right beside each other. I think they shared livery services in their time period. But as Rocky Mountain National Park Superintendent James Lloyd noted in 1958, quote, the operation of Onahu Ranch had never been successful. That's kind of a damning statement. So in this case, we looked at the Hurdle homestead before. This time we're going to look at the Christensen homestead. This is rancher Mark Christensen, who got his patent for this 160-acre homestead on September 2nd, 1920. So think about that. There's already been, almost 40 years of occupation at Green Mountain Ranch, but not here, which is part of why it wasn't as successful. This is more marginal land than what Green Mountain Ranch had had. The Christensens came from Denmark, which makes me wonder if they weren't associated with the Green Mountain, with Green Mountain folks. On October 9th, 1886, Mark Christensen married Maria Peterson in Fort Collins. They had one son, Andy Burdell Christensen. They moved here. It seems like Mark really ran this. Andy got very interested in automobiles, and he actually opened up the first service station in Grand Lake. It would have been very early on. Around 1938, the Hall family became involved with the Christensen Ranch. Merle Hall was born on October 13th, 1887 in South Haven, Michigan. He too served in World War I. And he was a stonemason, which is interesting because when you go there now, there's a lot more stone buildings on the Onahu side of this land than there is in the Green Mountain, and I think it's because of Merle Hall. He married Mabel Shaw in 1918. By 1930, they were in Grand Lake, although I'm not sure they necessarily were operating anything just yet. But by 1938, we know they were there because this advertisement is from 1938. So it's clearly they're running it. And they didn't really operate a guest ranch like Green Mountain Ranch was. What they did is they operated a working ranch that just happened to have places for guests to stay. But they, at this point, didn't really have a lodge or anything like this. This is a curious piece I found. That's one of my favorite things from this project. And this is a letter that a woman wrote to her father describing their experience here at Onahu Ranch on the 4th of July weekend, 1938. And I'm going to read it to you over pictures that I've taken from Onahu and Green Mountain. So Thomas and Kathleen Cray and my Gray, Willie Gray, that's her husband, and I left early Saturday morning for Onahu's Ranch, which is about 150 miles from Denver and 6 miles on beyond beautiful Grand Lake. There are 125 acres in this preserve and several miles of Onahu Creek for guests to fish. We reached our cabin about 9:30 o'clock. At 11, we cast our hooks, and by 12 o'clock, we had 10 beautiful rainbow trout. By late afternoon, we had caught 50. Now that's almost unbelievable considering the reputation mountain trout have for being hard to catch. Well, we had fried fish for supper Saturday. One of my ambitions had been fulfilled in that I had all the rainbow trout I could eat. After the meal, we didn't have any desire to play pinochle. Can you imagine that? Sitting there in the cabin around the warm fire, We soon began to droop and decided to turn in for the night. WG and I chose the sleeping porch, and believe me, it was plenty crisp out there. We had lots of cover, and about the next thing I remember, it was Sunday morning, and 2 young deer were feeding right there on the lawn. We got up, soon had breakfast, and we were on our way to continue fishing. The fish weren't striking as well as the day before. We caught just 25. We packed this catch in snow and brought them into Denver. It's a July 4th weekend, and they're packing them in snow. In the afternoon, the 2 grays craved a little adventure. They put on their hip boots and went over to Baker Creek to do a little fishing. The creek is at the foot of a high mountain, and to get to it, one must wade through about a half mile of marshland, nearly hip deep in places. And very few people ever attempt to go over the marsh. The fishing in this creek is supposed to be wonderful due to the large beaver dams. When they reached the cabin, they flopped down on the bed, and Kathleen and I had to remove their boots. TG had snagged one of his boots and caught about a quart of water in it. WG had slipped and fallen in the mud, but we really did have lots of fun. Sometime in the early 1940s, the Halls sold this property to Clyde and Harriet Sargent. Clyde Sargent was born in 1906 in Denver. His wife, Boomie Sargent, was born in 1908, and she was the daughter of Colorado banker Henry Beatty, who was also Colorado's first bank commissioner, was big in high finance in Denver. They had one daughter, Beverly, born in 1928. And I talked about the theme of closeness. Beverly Sargent actually married Richard Cecil Dick McLaren, who was the eldest son of legendary Rocky Mountain National Park ranger Fred McLaren, who, if you know anything about the park and their buildings, one of the buildings there in the utility area is McLaren Hall, named after him. So they're that close. He was actually, his son, Dick McLaren, was actually a championship skier as well. And he was a chief at Grand Canyon National Park. And like the Nelsons at adjacent Green Mountain Ranch, the Sargents officially transformed this into a guest ranch by building this lodge, which is one of its most distinctive features. It's pretty remarkable with these octagonal bays sticking out of it. One has sort of a lounge area. The other has a dining room. According to a 1947 brochure from the Union Pacific Railroad, Onahu Ranch featured riding, fishing, boating, swimming, and pack trips to Central City and Grand Lake. By August 1948, Clyde Sargent was starting to run ads to sell the ranch. And this was happening right around the late 40s, early 50s. The economics of running these dude ranches is beginning to change. You're beginning to see it here. You can see he's asking $60,000 for the ranch. Purchasing the ranch from the Sargents were Joe and Myrtle Blotter. Joseph Blotter was born in 1900 in Sioux City, Iowa, from parents who had immigrated from Austria. The family actually lived in Seibert, Colorado, out in the plains. Myrtle Sanders, his wife, was born in 1903 in Minnesota. They were married in Cheyenne Wells on June 3rd, 1929. And of course, this is a photograph of the couple from Onahu Ranch. Assisting Joe and Myrtle at Onahu was their son, Doyle William Blotter, who worked as their wrangler. You can see another advertisement. It's interesting, Onahu Ranch, I think, was more of a true dude ranch in that you could ride a horse there. Green Mountain, there weren't as many people interested in riding horses, I've noticed. Right? It was really Onahu that was about that. Estes Park resident and cowboy singer Ron Ball worked at Onahu Ranch for 3 seasons. He remembered particularly the weekly rodeos. He said, "We had our own rodeo every Sunday, so I rode bareback horses and steers. We didn't have bulls, and roped calves and barrel raced." And I know it's a little hard to see, but that is a dog on a donkey. And I got to tell you, I'd pay all the money to see that. The Blotter period ownership was probably the most successful for Onahu Ranch, but it was never close to the same operation that Green Mountain was. So now we get to the most interesting part of the story, I think, and that is, how do we go from these private properties to the public domain and the Park Service acquiring them? Because it's an interesting tale. So the story of the big shift in this trend of private landholding in the West, as seen through these case studies of Onahu Ranch and Green Mountain Ranch, begins in 1953 when the Nelsons first offered to sell a 20.46 acre tract of land that was north of Green Mountain Ranch but was not contiguous to it. So it was sort of an appendage. The transaction led Rocky Mountain National Park to more seriously consider the acquisition of Green Mountain Ranch proper. In the years that followed, the Park Service evaluated and assessed the property over and over and over again and could not make a deal work. For instance, when Superintendent David Canfield learned that the park could access $25,000 for property acquisition, his first suggestion was buy Green Mountain Ranch. This is one of my favorite finds here. The story is similar at Onahu Ranch. On August 18th, 1956, Joe Blotter sent 2 letters to Wayne Hackett, who was the United States Commissioner for Rocky Mountain National Park. The first, or the official letter, was dated August 16th. And in it, Blotter wondered, quote, if the Park Service is buying any ranches in the national park at this time. If they are, we might be interested in selling Onahu Ranch. Take a look, let this soak in. Because this was actually sent with another letter, a cover letter on top of it. This is the cover letter. And it told a different story. It says, my wife has been after me to contact you in regard to selling the ranch to the park, so to keep peace in the family, I'm doing that reluctantly. Not only that, let's be forensics here. We can get into, criminal forensics. They're both signed by J.W. Blotter, but the handwriting is different. The salutations are different. One is Mr. Hackett, the other one is Wayne, right? This one has Joe signed on it. This one doesn't. So if you want my take on what actually happened here is, Mrs. Blotter was getting tired of running the ranch, right? She wrote this letter, signed his name, told it to it, and said, you mail that. He doesn't want to sell it, so he adds this note to the outside of it that's the wink, wink, I've given you the letter, the wife will be happy, but I'm out riding my horse, so see if you can find me, right? This happens a lot in this time period. One spouse wants to get rid of it, the other doesn't. So I love these 2 letters. As would be the case at Green Mountain Ranch, the park's first attempt to purchase Onahu Ranch was unsuccessful and led to another private sale. This case to the new owner, Ophelia Wolter. Her story here is really sad. She was actually a very well-educated woman. She had, I think, 3 master's degrees. One in education, one in philosophy, and one in business, I believe. And she taught at Denver East High School, where she was head of their business program. And after her husband died, she had a nephew that wanted to get into business with her. They bought this ranch and realized they had no idea what they were doing. And they bought it on a lot of credit. And she immediately had large payments due. The ranch wasn't doing anything. And so she wanted to get out of it. She actually retained a guy named Gilbert May to approach the Park Service to see if they would buy it, but the park didn't have funds for it. In fact, Deputy Superintendent Hartzog at that time, he writes, I told Mr. May that I regretted that we had to be so discouraging with respect to sale to the government at this time, but little purpose would seem to be served by attempting to negotiate with him. On October 19th, 1957, another advertisement offering up Onahu Ranch for sale appears in the Denver Post. And then on June 25th, 1958, RMNP Superintendent James Lloyd writes to the regional director, he says, lately, we have been informed by different sources that Miss Wolter is in distress with her transaction and is offering the property for $40,000 in an effort to free herself from its attendant obligations. He goes on to note that the park had appraised the property for $67,000, and it says, we will not only make a deal in the best interest of the government, but can eliminate another undesirable commercial inholding along Trail Ridge Road. There you're starting to see the ethic of Mission 66 in there. But it doesn't work. The park still can't buy it. So it goes to another private party, and that would be Edna and Wilsie Jameson. Wilsie was an interesting character. He actually grew up as part of sort of not a cult, but a very conservative religious group out in Kansas. But he was a master wood craftsman, and he worked for the Groswald Ski Company. If you know anything about ski history, Groswald was the guy who basically invented skiing in Colorado. He started several, I think he developed Arapahoe Basin, Berthoud Pass, and Winter Park. He was his master ski designer. And he, back when skis were still made of wood, he's the guy who did it. But they ran into a similar thing. Oh, I should say Edna actually ran the cafeterias at the University of Denver and later at Englewood Public Schools. And her idea was to bring her cooking, her kitchen operation into Onahu Lodge and make it work that way. It didn't work out. They wanted to sell it as well. And eventually Edna has a heart attack. Her doctor says, you can't be living there anymore. You've got to go to a lower elevation. So once again, we see a woman who is forced by these health conditions, by the harshness of the environment, even this late in the history, to leave. Later in 1958, after this heart attack, neighbor John Holsworth finds out. If you ever do any history of the west side of the park, John Holsworth has his finger in everything on that side of the park. He's always stirring the pot. And he says, he finds out about it, and he says to the assistant superintendent, you know what, maybe I'll just buy it. Well, he's just saying that just to get them riled up, because that's the stuff he would do. So here's Superintendent James Lloyd. He was the superintendent during most of Mission 66. And most of what's happening is going to happen under his watch. So he makes the purchase of Onahu Lodge the #1 priority of the park. And on January 2nd, 1952, there's 2 appraisals, and the park offers the Jamesons $55,000. But something happened. Onahu Ranch was actually profitable that last year. And so they renegotiated because now the Jamesons wanted more money. Well, the real estate people were really confused by this, and they wondered if something else was at work, and they said, Wilsie Jameson, this is a quote from a report, admitted that Johnny Holsworth had been working on him to hold out for a bigger price so that the government would pay him a higher price for his ranch. So again, John Holsworth is working the game here. They eventually accepted a $60,000 offer for their property, and they signed the contract on March 12th. There was some bureaucratic wrangling, and they actually operated under a special use permit for a year, but on December 31st, 1960, Onahu Lodge returned to the public domain. So this private property had now become part of the federal domain again. It's today, this lodge building is still there. It's used as housing primarily for the trail crews who love this place. They treat it with a lot of respect. The drive to purchase Onahu Ranch and eliminate another undesirable inholding along Trail Ridge Road, as it was called, was directly a result of Mission 66. In the spring of 1959, as the park was concluding its Onahu Ranch purchase, they basically said, look, we got Onahu, we got to get Green Mountain now. We've got to get the whole thing. And so they approached Carl Nelson, who actually worked at this point at the pumping plant in Granby, that's between the 2 reservoirs there. Carl Nelson expressed to them his concerns about the future development at Green Mountain and the west side of the park in light of Mission 66. And that's important because I run into historians who often say that Mission 66 is overplayed. Its role wasn't that big. Here we see a west side landowner who's concerned about his property because of Mission 66. He's actually saying this. So yeah, everyday Americans did know what this thing was, and it had real ramifications. In response to this, Federal Realty Officer Ray Umphrey and a management assistant named Boyer met with Nelson here at the plant, and Umphrey told Nelson that Mission 66, quote, gave him insecure tenure in his holding. That actually is a fib. That's not true. Right? It wouldn't change the legal status of your inholding, but it may change the marketability of your inholding. And I think that's probably what he meant. Continuing with the quote from this report, it said, Nelson did feel his wife would welcome a change as she presently works every day throughout the summer from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. Ultimately, the Nelsons said they wanted to keep running this until 1966. But they were all over the board during this time period. They actually decided that while they were running Green Mountain Ranch, they would also try to develop a golf resort on Oahu in Hawaii, right? Which, as you'll notice, is not an easy thing to do. They developed the Pacific Palisades Golf Course in Honolulu in 1961. So they're corresponding with the park about selling the ranch from Honolulu, which is really interesting. But I think many of you can probably understand the sentiment. They actually abandoned that plan and came back. And they said, we liked Hawaii as a vacation center, but didn't realize the congestion and smallness of the area. And the longer we stayed, the more confined we felt and the more we missed Colorado. And I think all of us can feel that way, right? Nothing is quite like Colorado. So their departure from this experience in Hawaii really alarmed the park because the park saw this as their time to buy it. Now they're back at Green Mountain Ranch. We're going through superintendents at this time. They keep making offers. Nothing is happening. Eventually, the Nelsons start playing hardball. They're saying, okay, we're committed to this. We're really going to develop it. And they decided one of the things they wanted to do was to put a 40-unit motel on Trail Ridge Road. So you can envision this. I'm using high-tech. I'm going to use some high technology here so you can envision what that would have looked like. So there you go. That's what could have been, right? Were they actually going to build a 40-unit motel? I doubt it, right? But the whole thing is to get the park nervous about this. The regional director immediately appealed to Conrad Worth, who was director of the Park Service and the guy who invented Mission 66. He authorized the land chief of the Park Service to begin formal negotiations to buy the ranch once and for all because of this motel threat. In the end, they offered $104,375. The Nelsons wanted $1 million. Wasn't going to happen. Carl Nelson later wrote, I felt at the time it was being made was an inopportune time of the year and also seemed to be a very hurried affair. By that time we had lost any interest we may have had in selling. But this impasse quickly grew into a crisis because there wasn't a motel, but they were definitely investing in it. They were increasing the size of the lodge, there were reports coming from West Side Rangers to the superintendent about, quote, further non-conforming uses that were being developed at the Nelsons since the summer of 1963. There's an unnamed author of a federal land acquisition proposal who concluded that, who actually had suggested using eminent domain to secure Green Mountain Ranch, which they realized was a big problem, right? Once that got back to the superintendent said, absolutely not, because of those close relationships, right? You could never do this to the Nelsons. And he actually said, present owners have been excellent neighbors. And then later said, owner has expressed willingness to negotiate, do not condemn. But they continued their major improvements, including putting a swimming pool on. This is actually a matter of a lot of controversy of what happened with the swimming pool. The Grand Lake Historical Society in their history actually says that this was an attempt to raise the value of the property. They actually called it an Olympic-sized swimming pool. If you see the measurements, 60 by 25 is not an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's not even a very big swimming pool. So that's not true. The other thing is, this is just how dude ranches were trying to survive into the 50s because of that change in leisure culture, right? They're trying to be more like motels. The same thing happened here. McGraw Ranch on the east side of the park also built a swimming pool during the same time period because of that same thing of trying to get that motel traffic. So I think it's unfair to say they did this solely to raise the value of their property. They also improved the main house. You can see that Henry Schnorr's little cabin is completely gone now. This building no longer exists, largely because the park couldn't justify its integrity anymore because it had been so added onto and messed up over the years. The park actually informed the Nelsons that they now had access to this opportunity purchase program. If they were ready to sell, they could produce the money then and there. They said, no, we're happy with the status quo. We just want to stay here. Yet the Nelsons' response to the park's most recent attempt through this Opportunity Purchase Act gives you an idea of what the operation was like in the late 60s. It says, this is from Carl Nelson himself, he says that the ranch could accommodate between 80 and 85 guests. It operated at 100% capacity in its 90-day operating season. He reported that the gross income for the summer of 1968 was 32% higher than the previous summer, which was in turn 40% higher than the summer before that. His gross income averaged around $72,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $500,000. So this was a big operation, and it's going well, which is why you can see the Nelsons weren't that big of a hurry to sell at this point. The Nelsons let the superintendent Novak, who was superintendent at that time, know that his family's resistance to selling the ranch, however, wasn't just about financial considerations. He said, and this is a quote, "We have lived in this beautiful spot 34 years, and while we realize this cannot continue indefinitely, we hope to delay the departure of, the day of departure as much as possible. After traveling across the country the winters of 1962 and 63, we realized that Colorado meant to us personally not only as a beautiful outdoor recreation country to live in, but the privilege of earning one's living in such an atmosphere, and this requiring only 4 months out of the year, which is a large asset in itself. We have always felt that a considerable portion of our reward we received from our operation is the many friendships we have formed and the pleasures the guests seem to derive from spending a few days in Rocky Mountain National Park." True to their words, the Nelsons operated the ranch for the next 2 or 3 years and then decided to consider selling it. In that time period, it was lauded in a national newspaper as the best guest ranch in the Rocky Mountain region. In 1971, however, the Nelsons did something they had never done before. They closed a month early. And luckily, right, the park managers had been through this how many times with them, they knew something was up if they were closing. It turns out Carl Nelson's health was failing, but they didn't know this at the time. So sensing that something was wrong, Stephen Gaspar, who was the real estate specialist for the National Park Service in Omaha, he actually got in his car immediately as he heard this and drove all the way to Grand Lake because he knew this was their opportunity. He was there on the following day, and he convinced the family to allow the park to appraise the property and open formal negotiations. But as he said, quote, "The appraisers were instructed to exercise extreme secrecy. If information had gotten into the hands of speculators, we could very likely have to compete for the purchase. Since land speculation in the area is extremely active, corporations are now purchasing such properties to be used as executive retreats." Right? This again showing you that the Nelson sale to the park wasn't inevitable. Right? There were other parties there, and the park was aware of it. The Nelsons sought $1 million, which was more than it was appraised for, but Gaspar pointed out a few benefits of that price. One is all the water rights came with it and had considerable water rights, which is a big deal. And also all the furnishings, all the other things that you don't include in appraisal would be conveyed with the ranch. So the park ultimately accepted the $1 million counteroffer. On December 15th, the director of the Midwest region appealed to Park Service Director George Hartzog to approve it, and he did on December 23rd. And here we have news of it on February 21st, 1972, in the Greeley Tribune about the purchase of Green Mountain Ranch, which left only the Halsworth Ranch as the only large private inholding left on the west side of the park. Actually, negotiations for the purchase of Halsworth began right after this happened. You'll notice here, though, that the price is $1,000,001. And it says here, it's a quote from Ada Nelson, that I held out for the extra dollar so I could say truthfully that we got more than $1,000,000. I can tell you I have seen the deed, I've seen the transfers, they got paid $1,000,000. So I'm not sure whether the superintendent just slipped them a dollar bill or what it was so they could actually print this thing about getting $1,000,001. But I included, when I clipped this, I had to include this part too. Hungarian people hope to hug a hog for luck on New Year's. So you learned that at the very least in this presentation. So in closing, I want to reiterate that what makes this very complicated and very interesting from a historical point is I can point out all these big processes going on. I can point out Mission 66 and environmental awareness, that you wouldn't sell a large property in a national park to a private interest anymore. You would sell it to the Park Service. I could talk about this, but in the end, it's really personal relationships that shape so much of this. And it's been really interesting in studying the relationships of inholders to the park. And you can actually see this here in the letter to Hartzog that I opened this lecture with. And now I'm closing with it. The Nelsons actually talk about the fact that the reason they sold was their friendships with the park, right? And I might say, and important here is this line here, I might add that this friendly feeling has always held true during our many years of tenure at the ranch. And I think that says something exceptional, that the Park Service we have today, or the Rocky Mountain National Park that we have today, is really the result of all of these really broadly thinking personal relationships that made it all possible. All right, and that's all there is to it. There are my image sources. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
How did the Park Service, why weren't there more things that had already been homesteaded when the Park Service started buying things? Not just in Rocky, but Yellowstone and all those other things.
This is where we think with sort of late 20th and 21st century minds, right?
You're right.
A lot of the land, the available homesteads that would have been in Rocky Mountain National Park had no value because you couldn't ranch them, you couldn't farm them, you couldn't do anything with them, right? So it's kind of this strange thing that a lot of national parks actually evolved from places where there weren't homesteads because they weren't desirable in that original thought of how you use land.
Do you know what the population of Colorado was?
I don't know. It was small. And you know, some national parks like Shenandoah had to be, is the opposite story. It was all private land, and it had to all be acquired and pieced together, right? So Western parks are usually the only ones that have the access to those large federal villages. And it was still a patchwork, I'm sure. I mean, they've spent the last 100 years sort of working that through.
Do you know how many inholdings there still are?
I don't know, but it's a surprisingly large number. But there's no large inholdings left. And that was really what they were going after. They weren't so concerned with little cabins here and there. They wanted to get the large inholdings. Yeah.
A follow-up to that question. Isn't there some type of clause now for the folks who have inholdings now where it has to stay in the family, that if the family lets it go, it has to go to the
That's a life estate, yeah.
Okay.
And that's actually an outcome, and Rachel, you may know this, from Mission 66 as well. I think they really advocated if you couldn't get the property, then you would help them. You would help property owners, inholders with these life estates.
Yeah, that's Park Service specific. The Forest Service is a lot different, where you can sell your permit.
Yeah, that's right. And the Forest Service has inholdings like that as well, though. Lots of them.
Yes, it's a nightmare.
There are other questions? All right, thank you so much. I should have told you, I was supposed to give this talk on the west side. I was asked to do it, I believe, January 7th. Someone had sent me an email about presenting my findings from this project, and it got called off because of COVID. So I never thought I'd actually get to do this. So I'm so happy I got to do it. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, how interesting.
I don't know why, I signed up.
Fascinating stuff.
No, it's a.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's right on the edge, right between, so their road is actually, I think, in the park. But they own, yeah, and there was, when I was researching this, I actually found the discussion and debate about the park boundary, because they were originally thinking about including Grand Lake Lodge in the boundary, but they actually ended up excluding it. But I know that, like, they can't develop or do anything out there without approval from the Park Service. Yeah. It is interesting, yeah. But they talked about, there was actually a big deal about, all right, if we eliminate Grand Lake Lodge from the boundaries, then we've got to buy Green Mountain and Onahu, because they'll be the last big private property left. Right, so in some ways, that was an impetus for buying. Yeah, you're welcome.
You're an excellent historian.
Thank you.
That was fantastic.
Thank you.
That was very reminiscent of all the, history professors have a certain style and delivery, and I think you nailed it.
Because we like to take all the facts and construct a narrative, right?
Yes.
Beginning, middle, and end, have things happening.
And had a nice thesis slide. Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.